Folks, it's time. We are here today for another Virtually Agile meetup. It's a pleasure to host you once more. Fred and I, my co-host, over in the corner, we're wearing the other Christmassy thing, top left of my screen. And we're joined by Cliff Hazell. He's from Spotify once upon a time. He's going to talk to us today about copy and paste Agile, or beyond copy and paste Agile is more accurate. I'm going to allow Cliff to share his screen so he can show us all the good things. And we welcome him today. Thank you for joining us, Cliff.
Thanks, Chris. It's good to be here. Nice to join you once again. I feel like we've been chatting a fair amount over the last couple of weeks, which has been quite nice. So, yeah. Cool. So good evening, everyone.
One thing I just want to say very quickly is that Cliff and his question policy is ask whenever. So if something comes to mind, don't hesitate to ask. You don't need to wait for the end. Myself and Fred are monitoring the chat like hawks, so we'll keep an eye out there. If you got something, let us know. Back to you, Cliff.
Cool. I'm just trying to see how to rearrange the view. I'm new to this tool. It's very cool, and I need to play with it at some point to figure out all the tips and tricks. I like to see people while I talk to them, so that's what I'm mostly trying to optimize for. I think I can get it like this. There we go. Cool. Now that the technical difficulties are sorted out, I can see everyone and my slides on the same page. Cool. So nice to meet all of you. And I wanted to share with you a couple of ideas that I have been experiencing. And I'm just going to jump straight in because my introduction is built into the story. So as Chris said, please feel free to ask questions as you go. Type in the chat or just unmute yourself and feel free to say something. So aside from Jay, who I think knows where this is, can anyone tell me, where is this? Do you know where this place is? Someone else also knows? Yeah, it's so good it could possibly be an AI-generated picture. So this is in fact Cape Town, South Africa, which is my home before where I am now, which we'll come to in a minute. But I grew up in the world of product management here. It's a beautiful place if you get the opportunity to visit. A lot of wonderful wine, lovely people, beautiful nature, excellent beaches. Not quite as much electricity as I would hope all year round, but certainly plenty of great weather and wonderful beaches to hang out if you like that kind of thing. So I was hanging out, doing my thing, mostly working in telecoms. I was head of product at a company that side, and then got found by another company and asked if I would like to come and move to here. Does anyone know where this is? Very close. We're in the right region. Yes, Kasparis is correct. This is Stockholm, Sweden. It's perhaps not the traditional angle that you would see, but if you've been to the city, you will have seen this before. This is looking at the Old Town area, quite a wonderful part of the city. So in about 2013, as I said, I was hanging out in Cape Town and got the opportunity to come and join over this side. Joined a company called Spotify that some of you may have heard of. Where I spent about 4.5 years coaching a number of teams, leadership teams, and helping build out some of the offices, working on acquisitions and a bunch of things. And during my time there, I found that a lot of people were already starting to get quite excited. Maybe just by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of this thing called the Spotify model, or you've heard that phrase at least?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, sounds like quite a few. So this talk is really designed in response to what I started experiencing during that time, which was a lot of people getting very excited about it. And I wanted to try to kind of counter some of the narrative that I thought was maybe a little bit overexcited about copying things and perhaps not paying attention to some of the important details. So this is my story. It starts with a wonderful story and a great picture. So the story goes that a young kid is watching their parents cooking dinner. And as the parents are cooking dinner, the kid, of course, is watching, asking some questions, and the kid notices that the parents slice a piece of the roast off the pan just before they stick it inside the oven. A kid, of course, for those of you who know, you know the famous question that kids love to ask all the time is, of course, why? Why do you do this? When parents look at each other and they say, well, actually, I don't know. We learned this from our parents. So they go and they ask the grandparents, and they also don't know the answer. So they ask the great grandparents, who start laughing immediately as they get asked this question and say, well, my dears, when we got married, we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have a very big house. And as a result, our oven was quite small. And so the reality was that the only way to fit the roast inside the pan was to cut a piece off the side and save it for another time. Now, I tell you this story because I think this is quite similar to what we do a lot of the time inside our organizations. We copy and learn things throughout the generations from other people without necessarily understanding what is the context or the problem in which they were applying that solution. So to put it more specifically, if you don't have a small oven, you do not need to cut a piece off the roast. And yet I think we do this quite consistently. We borrow OKRs, we borrow the Spotify model, we organizational structures, all kinds of manner and tools. And so what I want to talk to you about today is really about how to look at your organization to try to understand where and what problems you might have and what opportunities you have for improvement before you jump to the idea of solutions and maybe copying things from Spotify or anybody else for that matter. So this question is, well, I talk a bit about this idea of perception, right? And we sort of say, well, how do you perceive your company? How do you understand its current capability? For most of you, if you go through the interview process, probably you get a story that sort of metaphorically looks a little bit like this. Everything's shiny, new, modern, quite up to date. But the reality might be a little bit different. After you've gone through the interview process and you start on day one, maybe you find out that the company is a little bit more like this on the inside. Of course, there's nothing necessarily wrong with this type of oven or way of cooking. But the reality is that it might have some different capabilities. This one runs on wood, the other one ran on electricity. Two different ways of doing things. Of course, after you spend a little bit of time at the company, perhaps you start to notice some of the challenges that they face. And maybe you realize that actually it looks a little bit more like this on the inside. And maybe even after a couple of months or a crazy incident, you realize actually quite often it's a little bit more like this, yeah? So the question for me is, why is this perception important? And I think part of the reason why this is the case, or why it's so important to me, is because all three of these different methods of cooking can all produce a fantastic dinner. But what capabilities and possibilities they have are quite different. You can cook a fantastic pizza in the top left, but if you try to cook a pizza in the microwave, I don't know, maybe not so good. Fantastic for warming it up, but not for the first time round. So what I want to do is keep in your mind as we explore these concepts and ideas, really what type of oven are you talking about? What type of situation and context do you have in your organization before we jump to what solutions do we need to apply? And so I think this is important if we want to go beyond this thing of just doing copy paste agile. And so what I'm going to do is take you through a couple of different ideas that I have around this. And I'd like to give you the takeaways that I'd like you to have before. So the takeaways for me from this presentation are this idea that if we want to go beyond copy paste agile, what we first need to do is create focus so that we have breathing room to be able to operate within our organizations. We're far too busy running around doing thousands of different things, and we're not really sure what's working. If we can create some focus, have a little bit of slack in the system, we can start to do the second one, which is find leverage, right? This allows us to find the things that really make a difference, whether that be to our revenue, to our employees, to our customers, to the environment, whatever it is that we choose to have impact on. And the third step, or the third takeaway, is that we need to focus on building habits so that we can consistently do this and make our defaults more likely to produce success. So we're going to take a look at this through three different lenses: systems, science, and sapiens, which is a nice little rhyme. And basically, it ties into each of the takeaways. So systems is looking beyond the team level to create focus, of the possibility to create focus at all levels, or all flight levels in your organization. Science is how we find the leverage, so the actual scientific process through which we figure out what is working. And sapiens, how we build the habits so that we design around our intentional biases. So if you're ready, I'm going to jump in to number one, which is systems. Where and what to create focus on. So, how many of you have experienced something like this, maybe on a day-to-day basis, or maybe it's regular in your organization? Does this image sound or feel familiar to you? I love the sound effects. Cool. So you've all been here, you've seen something a little bit like this. I'm sure you've also seen it visualized a different way, which is this highly utilized highway. And I think the challenge really is that a large amount of the time as managers and leaders in our organization and as individuals, what we're actually doing is that we're approaching a situation that already looks like this highway. And then what we're doing is we're saying, hey, well, if you see over here, do you see my mouse, by the way? Yeah, cool.
Yes.
So if you see over here, there's a little gap between the cars. What actually we should do is we want to be really efficient. And so what we're going to do is we should fit a few more cars in this gap, maybe a few more over here. We could put a bus or two over there, maybe a car mover over here, this kind of thing. We're essentially trying to optimize for efficiency before we've optimized for effectiveness. So there's another way to look at this. And if you think of your organization essentially as a keyboard, essentially what we've done is that we have organized ourselves around each row on the keyboard. So the customer has come to us and says, our wish is that you create us a love letter. And what we've got is basically a scenario where we're trying to coordinate between multiple teams because not everybody can do every single part of writing this letter. And of course, as we grow and scale up, we tend to specialize our teams even further. And pretty soon what you have is one team owning a single key on the keyboard. Now, just like the metaphor of the highway that I used earlier, what you find is that we're really trying to get the team that pushes the A key to push that key as fast as possible. And the challenge with this is that as fast as you can push that A key, doesn't actually produce a better letter. What we need to do in order to write the letter effectively is that we need the right team pushing the right key at the right time. So the conversation that we need to be having is not one of how do we make our teams and individuals produce as much as possible. It is one of how do we coordinate between all of the different things that we're trying to do. What this means is the conversation is about feedback loops. And I love this picture. It's probably one of my favorite slides. I think that every organization needs to be having several more healthy doses of these, perhaps even for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So if this is the first part of the challenge, we're lacking the feedback loops, I think that there's a second part to this as well. So if we look at the organization through the lens of a single team, what you find is that really there's probably some kind of visualization a little bit like this if we're working in an agile environment. But the question that we ask is, well, when something lands in done, is it done from the customer's perspective? Did we finish the letter? Well, the short answer is usually no. Maybe we wait for some integration, perhaps there's some acceptance testing, and even waiting for release. Now, maybe as we become a little bit more agile, some of these things start to collapse a little bit into each other. But certainly in a lot of traditional organizations, these things are not happening on the same frequency that we're writing the software. Of course, we've only talked about one side of this. And if we start saying, well, what happens in the other direction? The reality is this is only the developer's backlog. And there's actually quite a lot of things that happened before. Something like a product backlog, maybe some idea pools, steering committees, a bit of approval, some kind of triage and so on. And quite soon what you see is that when we zoom out and we look at the full picture, we're maybe not doing things quite as fast as we thought we had. And really what's happened here is that we're working on focusing on making the team as quick as possible, the A key pushed as quickly as possible. And at the end of the day, we're super agile. That's great. But from a customer perspective, the letter does not get produced. So what I want to do is suggest that what often happens if we don't solve these two challenges, both the one of the keyboard and of this full end-to-end system, is that we end up in this situation, right? We find that we're having yet another reorg. These things tend to be very, very common, unfortunately, especially in the present days with the economic situation and people feeling that this is the right way to solve their problems. Part of the issue here, I think, is that if we want to build an effective organization, what we need to be doing is thinking about two parts of this puzzle. Don Reinertsen has an excellent quote in which he sums this up. He says that decentralizing decision-making is not only about giving teams the authority to make decisions, we also need to make sure that they have access to good information in order to be able to make good decisions as well. And so I think that this is really creating a huge opportunity for us. And the metaphor for me that I like to use in order to understand this and to think about where to put our focus and how do we actually create a better, more coherent flow of information is through the lens of flight levels. Quite simply, the metaphor is if you fly high, you see quite far into the future, but you don't see so much detail. And if you fly close to the ground, you see a lot of detail, but you lose the ability to see far into the distance. The idea here is not that one is better than the other, but what we actually want to do is create some kind of cohesion between each of the levels of abstraction and different views we take into the organization, but also consistency and communication between the teams. You'll notice that the directions of the arrows flow in all directions here. So what I want to put to you is that if we want to start to go beyond copy-paste Agile, what we need to do is think a little bit further beyond the team. We need to zoom out and focus on the interactions between the teams, not just on how the team itself is performing. There is another piece to this, and I think this is one of the things that I see a lot of companies struggling with. This is an example of one of the areas that I was working with at Spotify a few years ago. And if you look at their visualization over here on the right-hand side, what you'll see is a set of things called the current bets. What this essentially is the flight level 3 system, the strategic items being visualized on a coordination flight level 2 system that we talked about a second ago. And basically what we've done here is we've sequenced this set of bets in order. Now, this is not something I see a lot of companies do. They tend to have 6 lists, one from each department or one from each area of the business. So marketing has some needs, sales, finance, everybody has some different suggestions about what we should be doing. What we've actually done here is we've consolidated this into one single list and said there is a single number 1, a single number 2, and a single number 3. And what this has enabled us to do is to essentially create a situation where number 17 on our list is not blocking number 1. Because what this means is that we can say, this is clearly number 1. If I need your help from one of the other items, you should move and switch your attention until it's no longer needed onto number 1. And similarly, if you're asking for me to switch off from number 1 to number 17, I would probably say, sorry, you might have to come back a little bit later. So the idea here is don't let your number 17 block your number 1, and this starts to help us avoid making the traffic jams worse. So if you enjoy this kind of thinking around how we connect systems, there are 3 books that I can suggest that you may want to have a look at and read a little bit further on. The first one on the left-hand side is Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. This is essentially, I guess, the Bible, if you will, or some kind of sort of original text in a way, thinking in systems and talking all about different types of systems from ecology to forestry to biology. Really, really quite a profoundly powerful book. On the right-hand side, we have Escaping the Build Trap by Melissa Perry. She's actually got a new book out quite recently, but this is the one that I think is most relevant in this particular context. It talks about how to go beyond this thing of just getting stuck and constantly needing to build more, and how to build an effective product delivery organization. And of course, in the middle, we have Rethinking Agile by my friend Klaus Leopold. This book basically tells the story of flight levels and how the idea came about, and gives you some pointers on how to use this in your organization. So I've talked about 2 things so far under the topic of systems. The first one is to go beyond the team level and focus on the interactions between the teams, not just on optimizing the performance of any one single team. And the next piece is to not let your number 17 block your number 1, and to start to use this as a little bit of a mantra so that you can avoid creating traffic jams in your company. So I want to pause there for a second and see what questions are coming up before we jump into the next point around science.
I would say I like how you pointed out the risk of micro-focusing on the team's cycle time versus the entire system, because there's so much that goes in before that. And we talk about, like, on LinkedIn, all these agile things like flow, throughput, WIP limits, just within the confines of the team. But to get there, get that work there, there's little work that's done to visualize that. So it's an important reminder.
Yeah, I think we need to kind of think a little bit about what are we trying to optimize for. And if the team can deliver the entire product and everything into the market, then maybe that's fine. But very often we need some help from a marketing team, or maybe a sales team. Maybe there's professional services. Could be something like customer support even. Probably it's a good idea to balance a little bit of conversation between these areas and build some of this collaboration as well.
I like the mantra, don't let a 17 come at the cost of number 1. And I think I'd maybe shift the question ever so slightly and be saying, especially to the person that's asking for more, to say, hey, is this worth losing out on that? And to put the we have got that bias towards loss aversion.
Yeah.
So our number 1 priority right now, if we lose that to get this, is that worthwhile?
Yeah.
Do we want that? And often the answer is absolutely not.
I think there's several cases where it's quite intentional, and we can have that conversation as you suggest, Chris. I think also there's a lot of situations where we haven't really realized that we're doing it by mistake in our organization. So if you have the scenario where two different, I'll just simplify it to 2 different lists, but 2 departments ask for 2 conflicting things. Basically what you do is you push that down into the team. The team now have to make a decision about which one do they work on first. And they may want to do, they may pick either, but they may also pick both, which I would say is perhaps the worst version of either of those 2 outcomes. But the likelihood is that if you multiply this by, let's say you've got 15 teams that need to work on a big project or program, the likelihood that they all pick exactly the same thing, I think, is significantly reduced. And so a big part of what I'm trying to get to is that we have a more consistent approach, rather than necessarily getting exactly the right answer. Separately from this, we can have a conversation about which one should actually be at number 1, but we need to get in the habit of actually making it number 1 and being able to behave as if it is number 1 and consistently treat it as that. Because I think otherwise we spend a lot of time doing prioritization discussions, but at the end of the day, if we're just going to work on everything at the same time, well, I think a lot of that prioritization is perhaps wasteful.
There is a comment, Jay.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I actually think something interesting I noticed lately was we're so agile, we're afraid to make a call. We're afraid to give direction because we don't want to seem like, we're bossing people around. And that's great, but it's also unhelpful. So it's just something I've observed lately, which is the complete opposite of, the other way.
Yeah. I think a lot of folks have gotten quite allergic to the idea of a hierarchy because they've mostly seen it performing in a negative way, in the sense of a dictator, essentially. I exaggerate a little bit on purpose to kind of make the point, but I think in many situations there is a thing of like, if we nominate one person to take responsibility, be the product owner for a day, we're on holiday as a group, one person decides for today, the next person decides for tomorrow, something like this. These kind of approaches, that's essentially establishing a de facto hierarchy, but with some sort of parameters and boundaries. And I think in a lot of cases, these sort of things can be useful tools if we use them in a productive way. Where we use them to belittle, micromanage, dictate, these things can become problematic. But there are also advantages, because trying to make a decision where to go for lunch with 65 people this is really hard. It's much easier if we just say, you pick and we'll go there, and that person can know, hey, there's a bunch of vegans, there's some vegetarians, so let's make sure there's options for everyone, and make a good choice. We don't necessarily have to discuss everything in a group and do it that way. So, but there's pros and cons to this. Cool. So let's jump on to the second one, which is science, or how do we find our high leverage opportunities? So I showed you this slide earlier, but I have a new question for you, which is how many of you have tried this approach of when you're in this situation, just work harder? Does it work well for you?
Nope.
Maybe for a day or two, you can grind something out, perhaps at a push a week or so. I find usually beyond that, it tends to lead to burnout, a lot of pain, and not so much sustainability. But yeah, I think this is definitely something that I try to avoid as much as possible. There's moments where maybe you play a bit of catch up, but I want to put it to you that in almost every situation in your life, what you choose to work on matters far more than how hard you work. And I want to illustrate this with a little story. So the story is about this concept called Project Lollipop that I heard about. Basically, what happened was during my time at Spotify, one of the folks who worked in the IT equipment side of things, making sure everybody has laptops and keyboards, mouse, all of this kind of thing, they noticed that what was happening quite often was that folks might have something, I don't know, an old laptop, old monitor that they'd got a new one or an upgrade, but they hadn't yet taken the other one back. And so instead of writing some convoluted HR policy and requiring people to sign forms and stamp everything in and out, all he did was he went down to the local supermarket, bought a box of lollipops, and sent out a message on Slack that basically said, hey, along with a photo of the box of lollipops as well, said, if you've got anything lying around in your space that you're not using, bring it to me and you can have one of these. He joked and said that this was probably one of the highest return on investments you will ever find for a box of lollipops. I think probably in the order of €1 million plus in terms of equipment. He had to go and buy some further lollipops and repeat it in some of the other offices as well. But the reason that I tell you this is because I think very often what happens is we get overworked up about kind of rules and structure and very sort of hard ways of doing things, when in actual fact, what we could do is use a very high leverage approach like a box of lollipops, right? So I want to put to you, in your organization, think about what could be the lollipop or the box of lollipops in your situation. A simple action that has a huge outsized effect. So another piece of this for me is that often what happens is I think that the reason we don't necessarily know what has high leverage is because we can't often answer this question. I'm curious how many of you know for your team, what was the result, like the customer impact of the last thing that you delivered? So I did this talk a couple of weeks ago to a room of about 600 people. 2 hands went up, and one of them, in trying to answer the question, realized that they actually didn't know the answer. It was only one person in a room of about 600 who could say that they certainly knew. Now, I hope that some of you work in an organization where you do have some kind of feedback and you do know what the customer impact is of the things that you're delivering. But the question that I think is important to explore here is, why is it that we so rarely know the impact of what we're delivering? And I think quite simply, what it comes down to is that we're so busy trying to get things done that we very rarely make time to check the results. And so we seldom look for, and as a result, work on the things that have the really high leverage. Basically, we need to deliver something, learn from it, and use that information to inform our decisions about what do we do next. And the better we get at doing this, the more likely we are to avoid silly mistakes, and the more likely we are to do things that are effective and successful. One of the things that I think I see often in this space is that essentially the way that we plan our ideas, it looks a little bit like this. I don't know how many of you know the underpants gnomes from South Park, but essentially we are very clear on what we think we are doing right now. We know what the phase 3 is, but it's very rare that we've actually thought it all the way through and considered what is the step 2? What is that thing in the middle? So in South Park, they use the underpants gnomes as the example, but we've seen this in IT quite recently with big data. Everybody is excited about what the data is going to do. They're pretty confident that it's going to result in some profit, but so often there isn't actually a clear what is that step in the middle. I think part of the challenge here is that underlying all of these things, we have a couple of misconceptions about how human beings work, not just in terms of our broad diversity and the different approaches that we take to things, but even at a very fundamental and base level. So in this fantastic book, The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt explores this idea when he says, we think of the human mind as being something of a logic processor, right? We think that the way that we arrive at our conclusions is to look at some data, do some analysis, arrive at some sort of hypothesis, and then draw a conclusion. And the reality is that we actually have this completely backwards. The very vast majority of the time, what we do is we come up with a decision, or we decide using our intuition and gut feeling, and then we use our rational and reasoning ability to construct a story that explains the choice we've already made. So this is the first piece of it. The second part of this is what Annie Duke calls, is that we do what Annie Duke calls resulting. What we tend to do is, as she explained in the wonderful book, Thinking in Bets, basically what we do is we judge whether or not a decision was a good decision based on whether or not we achieved a result that we like or not. So what that means, Annie Duke is a poker player, or used to play poker. I think now she mostly writes books and talks about what she's learned from playing poker. But basically, if you play a hand of poker and you win, you think you made a good decision. And if you play a hand of poker and you lose, you think you made a bad decision. But that's actually not all of the information that goes into evaluating whether or not that was a good idea or not. You could have just got lucky, or you could have just got unlucky, right? And we need to be able to separate these two things. So the question, of course, then becomes, well, what do we do about this? How do we get out of this habit of doing resulting and just constructing narratives to explain our stories after the effect? I think what we can do at the beginning is really try to ask this question of, if we had this thing that we are proposing that we do, what would the benefit be? If we had it today, what would the benefit be? And essentially use that to write down our hypothesis, right? So I think that if I launch an online video course, I'm going to get 10 million people to take a course and learn about, going beyond copy-paste Agile. I could then test that hypothesis and say, well, 10 million people sounds like a lot. I don't have anywhere near that much influence in the world today. So maybe 10 million is a bit ambitious. How many people do I know? How many people do I think I could possibly actually get to take that course? And we could use that as a little bit of a reflective exercise. I can then also use this to reflect in the future once I've actually delivered what I've planned and say, well, there's a difference between what I thought would happen and what actually happened. And the gap between those two, that is my opportunity to learn and update my understanding of the world so that I can make a better decision for next time around. So essentially what we're doing is we're asking this question of what assumptions would need to be true in order for this to work. And you'll be amazed how often simply capturing your assumptions starts to point to which of those assumptions you think are actually sensible ones, and which ones maybe you could poke a little bit with a stick and go, I'm not so sure, and maybe make a better decision just by quantifying what you actually think would happen. So the first part of this is to quantify your hypothesis before you start and to use it as a reflection tool as you're moving through what you're doing. This works both for things like product changes, but I also like to point out that this also works for organizational design, maybe for coaching hypothesis, for hiring, for anything to do with your organization, not just for building products. Cool. So the second piece of using science is to start to look for our leverage points. So once we've got to a point where we have a hypothesis and we've tested something, we can now learn. What we start to do is look for where we have some sort of leverage. Now, to illustrate the point of what is leverage, there's a fantastic quote, I think from Steve Jobs originally. He refers to the computer as being like a bicycle for your mind. And what he is meaning with this is basically, if you think about a bicycle can convert the same amount of human energy as it takes to walk somewhere into a significantly larger distance, right? Same energy, bigger result. Now, the computer is doing the same thing for your mind. So to illustrate the point here a little bit more clearly, this is the difference in terms of the distance that can be covered using the same amount of energy. And as you can see, on the top, we have a bicycle, in the middle, we have a walker, and at the bottom, we have a car. So how do we use this in practice? Well, there's a wonderful human being called Shreyas Doshi, who I've been following on the internet for quite some time. And he has a framework that he uses called LNO that I've been using for probably the last 5 or 6 years. In this, basically, he describes things. If you think about anything that you want to do in life or in work, it roughly fits into one of these 3 buckets. On the left, we have leverage. In the middle, we have neutral. And on the right, we have overhead, right? So a simple example of this is basically, if you want to do something, or you have a bunch of things on your list, you can break them down into these different buckets and start to ask yourself the question, how much energy does it actually make sense to spend on this? So if we start with things in the overhead bucket, this might be something like, say, your taxes. You have to get it done, otherwise you go to jail, right? You don't get bonus points for doing 150% on your taxes. They're either done or they're not done, right? If you do 98% on your taxes, you may still go to jail, right? So there's no point in doing 98%. You need to do 100%. So the point here, as he says on the right-hand side, just get it done. Try to do an actively bad job. So just a passing grade, basically. Or I see someone in the comments, Jay, saying, try to get somebody else to do it. That's one way to do it as well. I get someone else to help me with my taxes, much cheaper. I know it's done right, and I don't have to worry about it. Then the neutral stuff, what we want to do here is do a good job, just a good enough job, no better, right? On the leverage side, however, this is where we could maybe try to let your perfectionist shine. This doesn't mean spend forever on it, but these are the things that are really going to have an enormously high impact, right? Something like writing that conference talk, applying to that job, taking a risk on a first date, moving to another country. These kind of things can really have a huge, huge impact, but you need to be able to do them effectively. I told you a story a little bit earlier on about Project Lollipop, right? And this for me is a perfect example of something that sits inside the high leverage space. A very, very simple action that has an enormously powerful impact. Don't think only about the high impact, also think about it relative to the effort that goes into it. Chris, I want to just quickly do a time check and confirm how we're doing on time, because I can skip one story if it's helpful.
We have about 15-ish minutes left. Depends on how much content you have left to go, Cliff.
Cool. So let me jump a little bit forward then. So to summarize this, basically the point here is that we want to find our leverage because the hypothesis basically that I'm putting forward here that I've been testing out for a significant amount of time here is that what you work on matters more than how hard you work. So if you want to read more about this, 3 books. I covered the 2 on the outside already, Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke and The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. The 3rd one in the middle is a book called Polarity Management. This talks about solving unsolvable problems, or how to identify and manage unsolvable problems, to be more specific. If you've ever noticed this oscillation that we have in companies where we go, let's centralize everything, and then 6 months later, oh, let's decentralize everything. 6 months later, new leader comes in, well, we should centralize the thing again. This kind of a pattern, he has some fantastic ideas about how to solve this kind of an issue. So just to recap the point on science, we need to start by quantifying our hypotheses before we start. So actually have a theory about what you think might happen and use that to reflect as you go. And second, start to look for the really high leverage activities so that you don't just work hard, but you can be smart. So I have one final point or topic for you this evening, which is to look at it through this beyond copy-paste agile through the lens of sapiens, how we build habits that consistently design around our bias. So I think very often what happens in our organization is that we face this challenge where some change needs to happen, and we're looking at it a little bit like this poor old grumpy cat. You know, there's only two things I don't like: change and the way things are, or at least this is how we think often about the world. Maybe you've heard this saying, people resist change. Have you heard this before? Yeah. Or maybe you've heard a more kind of harsh version of this, which is, oh, they won't work or won't work on that thing unless we tell them what to do. Now, I want to put to you that basically what this is suggesting is that we have the wrong people, or dead wood, essentially, inside our organization. Now, I think that if you have dead wood inside your company, there's really only two ways that it got there. Either you hired dead wood, or you hired live wood and you killed it. Both two of these are up to the company to address, and something that we should look into a little bit further. So you may be wondering, well, why does this happen? And I think I have a few theories of what contributes to this. And perhaps the leading one is that we tend to think about our organizations as machines, very mechanistic, interchangeable parts. We can just rip one thing out and put a new one in. And this is kind of, at least in theory, a lot of how our mental models work. Even if we think it's different, we tend to behave this way in terms of hiring, performance management, how we staff our teams, these kind of things. I think that a better metaphor for thinking about this is actually to use one of ecosystems, or if you think of a forest, right? If I want to grow a lovely forest like this, I don't put motivational values posters on the wall and set some quarterly OKRs, and then give a performance goal or incentive to each one of the trees. What I do, because we know that that would be absurd in the tree case, what I do is I plant in the right season. I make sure that there's enough biodiversity, nutrients in the soil, just enough rain, but not too much, right amount of sunlight, yeah, maybe a little pruning, maintenance, make sure that there's a good balance of bugs, birds, and animals, this kind of a thing. This is exactly what we need to be doing in our organizations. If the wood is dying, it's because the ecosystem is not functioning in a healthy manner. So there's a couple of things that I think affect our ability to do this effectively. And I want to ask a question to you. Does anybody able to tell me, or to take a guess, what do you think is happening here? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
I think they are fighting for the sari. This was the news in India.
Yeah, maybe fighting over something. Perhaps a celebration of some kind.
I see they're congratulating the lady.
Yeah, congratulating.
Yeah.
Getting a launch at ISRO.
Haha, somebody who knows the story.
Yes.
So I'll be honest, when I first saw this picture, it was someone actually doing a presentation not totally dissimilar to what I'm sharing with you today. And the question was asked, well, what do you think is going on here? I thought maybe it's a wedding, a graduation, something like this. It turns out these are the scientists from the Indian Space Agency, the ISRO, and they have just successfully put a orbiter around Mars. They have done this on their very first attempt. They did it for less money, a tenth of the cost, in fact, of what any country or company has done it before or since. They also did it on their first attempt. To make the point even more painfully clear, they put an orbiter on Mars for less money than Hollywood made The Martian. Right? Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is not because of their impressive achievements exclusively, but also because of the fact that we tend to make the assumption that people who look like the folks in this picture, they're not scientists. That's not where our brains go by default. Now, I don't want you to feel like you're a bad human because of this, because I will tell you in a minute what causes this and perhaps some of the things that we can do about it. But I want to illustrate this nicely with a second example. Can anyone tell me what's going on here?
A safe implementation, says Jay. Or the USA doing something naughty.
Yeah. So putting aside your
It looks like Utah, like Snowbird, right?
Yeah.
They're all
the
white
writing
guys.
of the Agile Manifesto. No. So the guy in the middle who's kind of pointing his hands like this one over here, that is Mike Pence, who at the time was the Vice President of the United States of America. And this, believe it or not, is actually Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights.
Are you joking?
I'm not.
I knew it. I called it.
Wow. Okay.
So I don't know about you, but I don't think that there's any possible way that this group could ever make a good decision on this topic, quite simply because there is no representation of any woman. I do believe that there's a slightly more zoomed out version of this photo. This is actually a photo from the internet. There were news articles about it. There is one woman kind of off to the left that you can't see in this version, but the woman who's in the room is making the tea, and so I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to fix much of the situation. So the point I'm trying to make here is that when we have these kind of biases, what this leads to is exclusion in various ways, and that hides many vital perspectives and a lot of information that would be very valuable when we're making these decisions, right? Now, this not only applies when we're making decisions about women's rights, but it also applies when we're making a decision about what product to build, which customers to serve, which needs of the internal employees to address, and how to go about doing it. Basically, what I'm putting forward here is this idea that perspective matters, and it is important if we want to see the full picture of what's going on. And I have my second favorite slide to illustrate the point. The same picture, the same thing is happening in both pictures. It just depends a little bit on where we stand. So basically what I want to put to you is that there's a number of things that we want to do so that we can try to shift the dynamic in our organization so that more of the perspectives can be effectively gathered and used in our decision making. It's not enough that the top 3 people or the 3 people at the top of the organization make the decisions, because then we solve only problems that they can see. And by definition, they will not see the vast majority of the problems and the opportunities within the organization. So if you're in a situation where meeting leaders feels like this, it likely means that if you're the kid on the right-hand side, you're not very likely to be able to voice many opinions or to challenge assumptions. You're probably not likely to make too many assumptions. And certainly in many contexts where we do things like a restructure, it feels this way. And so we design an organization that solves just the manager's problems, but not the issues that everybody else is seeing. So why does this happen? Well, many years ago, out on the plains of Africa, somewhere probably not too far from where I grew up, if you were wandering around just doing your thing and one of these jumped out from behind the bush, if you decided to take a decision-making process that goes something like this, you say, well, it's yellow, it's coming towards me, looks kind of hungry, it's moving quite fast. Oh yeah, it's definitely getting faster. The problem is, if this was your process, by that stage, you would already be lunch, right? Doesn't help. You don't survive to live another day. So what happened was we developed the ability to do what Daniel Kahneman calls a fast fit pattern match rather than a best fit pattern match. It looks slightly like a lion, so I'm going to run away. I don't wait around to find out. I make a snap judgment and I just decide. So the challenge with this is that essentially what we've got is we have to acknowledge that we have these biases. It leads us to creating a room for discussion around women's rights that contains only old white men. And it also leads to us making assumptions about Indian women and their scientific abilities and capabilities. And so what I think we need to do is we need to start to acknowledge some of these and then intentionally design around these biases so that we can start to get more effective at leading our organizations, our countries, and society at large. So in a very simplistic manner, and maybe just as a simple starting point, if you are all men, product managers, technicians from the same school, from the same country, invite some people who are different. Address the issue of diversity that you have. You need to fix, firstly, the representation as a single step. That's the first necessary condition. But it's not enough simply to have more people in the room. They also need to be able to participate meaningfully in that conversation. So what I like to say with this is that if diversity is being invited to the party, the second piece of inclusion is around also being able to choose the music. This is what I think we need to address. So I have a couple of examples that I could answer maybe when we're doing the Q&A, but just to give you one quick example on this, I think very often one way that we do this in our organizations is we have a very strong bias in most cases towards verbal communication. Maybe this is shifting a little bit now post-COVID with some of the teams working remotely and so on. But essentially what we're doing there is that if I stand up and say, well, here is my idea, what are your questions? What that means is that it's only the people who are comfortable with A, verbally giving their answer, and B, making a snap decision or a quick assessment of what I said. Those are the ideas and the opportunities that we are going to surface for further discussion. So if you want to kind of counter this, some things that I can suggest is to offer pre-reading. And I don't just mean send out your slide deck. You've heard of this example that Amazon uses, the one-page PR form. This is how we would pitch the product before we do it. Something along these lines. So give people an idea to read before they come to the meeting for further discussion. Specifically, make sure that they have time to think. Even if you do a verbal presentation, don't require answers and questions to come immediately. Ask people tomorrow, after the weekend, give them a chance to sleep on it, to process it a little bit. You'll get a much deeper thought. And also, I think it's a good idea to follow up afterwards and see what other thoughts have come up now that we've had some chance to process. So if you'd like to learn more a little bit about the Sapiens side of things, 3 books that I can recommend. Firstly, I hope all of you already know about Esther Derby. Her most recent book, 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. I can highly recommend this. On the right-hand side, we have Liz Wiseman with Multipliers, about how to be an effective leader that amplifies the effectiveness of those around you, and also things you might accidentally be doing that disable the teams around you. And in the middle, we have Edgar Schein with Humble Inquiry, specifically useful if you're trying to find ways to ask better questions and actually approach things without being too judgmental. And great book. So the first step here, I think, is that we have to acknowledge that we have the biases and so that we start to notice who's missing. And the second piece of this is that we need to then use that knowledge to design around these biases to build better habits that create more coherent understanding of the world in which we operate. So I started out by suggesting that what we wanted to try to do was move beyond this world of just copy-paste Agile, where we just borrow things from others without necessarily thinking about, what problems do we have and how do we solve them and involve other people in solving them. So if you want to move beyond copy-paste Agile, I want to encourage you to remember the 3 things that I think were the takeaways. So first step, create focus. Find the right level where you need to create focus. It's not always about pushing the A key. Sometimes it might be about the interactions between the teams instead. Secondly, once we have some space to actually breathe and move around within the organization without feeling like we're always behind, we can use that to generate some thinking time so that we can find our leverage and find better activities to spend our energy on. And thirdly, we want to sustain that by building some habits. So we looked at it through 3 lenses: systems, science, and sapiens. 3 different takeaways, 1 for each of the different lenses that we've looked at it. Now, often when I do this talk, I hear from people, they say, well, this sounds like a lot of effort. Coaching, teaching, mentoring, investing in our people, all of that sounds super expensive. What if we invest in our people and they leave, is essentially what I'm hearing in this. I want to put it to you that it's not so much about what if you invest and they leave, what if you don't and they stay? So with this closing thought, I want to say thank you for listening to me over the last few minutes, and invite you, if you'd like to continue this conversation or hear more of what I've been thinking about, or just connect with me and explore some of the ideas and things that you've been experiencing, join me on LinkedIn. I post almost every day. I'm slightly less active than Chris, although, no, I'm just joking. But yeah, I would love to chat to you and hear some of the things that you've been up to, and maybe what you found interesting, or something that you think that I would benefit from learning about. So I want to say thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful to be with you here so far. I think we have some time available for some questions and discussions. Chris, I think you're muted.
First things first, I was just saying that I've enabled the soundboard, folks, which means if you press the react button on the left-hand side, you now have access to a bunch of buttons you can press to show some love for Chris. For Cliff.
All good.
Show some love for Chris too. And Fred while we're at it.
Thank you, Daddy.
Where did that one come from? I'm going to remove that one. Did not know that one existed. Okay. Are there any questions for Cliff? Feel free to share your questions as you feel comfortable doing so. Speak aloud, type in the chat, whatever you are feeling.
I don't have a question, but I really appreciate. I enjoyed the session. This is the first session I'm attending with Virtual Agile, and that was an amazing perspective or view now, because I'm in the right stage now, dealing with new vendors and teams and structures, and there's a lot going in the organization currently. And this really helps me, because I'm trying to create the community of Agile in the teams, because I'm the one person fighting against the whole project management team here. So it's really very useful for me personally. Thanks for that.
To hear that.
Wonderful session. Thank you.
Great to have you join us for your first time at Virtually Agile. We hope to see you again another time.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to.
There's a question saying, what are your thoughts on the relevance of the Agile Manifesto now that it's 20 plus years old?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one a little bit, because I think it applies to a couple different things. So I find it intriguing how it's become almost like this thing that is unquestionable or unchallengeable. Similar to how people look at the Spotify model and go, well, we should do exactly that. And it's like, yeah, it was 20 years ago. And also, it's not a perfect, accurate representation of all the possible scenarios you might encounter. That doesn't also mean that on the other side, we should throw 100% of it away and say, well, it's all stupid. It's, if it's more than 4 minutes ago that we had the idea, it's now rubbish. I would love to see people being less dogmatic around it. And I think I just kind of have this allergy to anytime somebody is like, yeah, but the manifesto says, it's like, yeah, okay. But like, I can find you something that says anything I wanted to say. And the fact that they happen to write that, I mean, I don't know, take what you find useful from it, but be careful of just getting overexcited, because it's like, well, a bunch of dudes got together and had an idea, and now we can't possibly change it. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't want to say too much on it, but that's broadly my thought.
I mean, I'm right with you there on that one. That's my perspective, is that it's a document that was a product of its time. And one of the phrases that I reference most from it is that we are continuously discovering better ways of doing this. Yeah. That's not verbatim, but if we are truly continuously looking for better ways of doing things, that doesn't mean that we take a 20-plus-year-old piece of writing and use it as a Bible and say, you are not agile enough if you aren't doing X. So, yeah.
I think anytime something becomes unchangeable and law, I want to be very careful about the things that we put into that bucket, because if you have a look at any of the stuff sort of in the complexity and Cynefin space, those sort of things have a tendency of like we lock them in so hard, and then the world shifts, and now we're like, oh, we're only doing that thing, and we're actually in a chaos kind of a space, which is very, very expensive to recover from. I think there are plenty of contexts where we might need to do something a little bit more than what they've described in that paper. Yeah.
So another question is, where is it? I've lost it. Cliff, can you name 3 companies that ever successfully implemented the Spotify model in the past 20 years?
Ooh, I mean, I'm not even sure what that would look like or what that would even mean. I don't know. I think most of what I hear companies doing when they say they're doing the Spotify model is guilds, chapters, and tribes. And to me, these concepts are not necessarily new or unique to Spotify. Chapters are really just a matrix function. Guilds, I mean, this is a center of excellence, community of practice, something like this. And a tribe, this is just a purpose-led group of people who are bound together in some form. What I find intriguing is that people somehow borrow those 3 things and then also still get them wrong. So they do tribes, but then they don't have a mission. They have projects, or this is the tester tribe. I'm like, that's weird. Like, that's not the thing that like we were trying to solve at the time. So I don't know. I mean, I would argue that to some extent, like Spotify itself wasn't even trying to implement the Spotify model. It was kind of a set of Lego blocks that were like, hey, these are some things that you could find useful. But within the company, I mean, it's changed even more now. But certainly at the time that I was there, you would find teams that looked totally different to that model. And yeah, it just depending on the context, it would be constantly iterated on and tried. But the flip side is that it's not that no one was doing it, because almost everywhere I worked, there was something like a guild and something like a tribe and something like a chapter and something like a squad. So I don't know. I'm not sure that question is something that I can answer, because I don't think it's a thing that you could implement somewhere else, because the thing that was happening was that it was constantly evolving. And so if you find another company that's constantly evolving and learning and adapting how they work, then I would say, sure, they're being somewhat similar to Spotify, but it probably wouldn't look like the model. So I don't know if that's helpful at all. I kind of answered around the question.
I think the person was looking for a yes or no binary. Have you heard of, or are you aware of, at least 3 companies that were successful and that it was working? Sounds like the answer was kind of I don't know, and also I'm not sure it's a question that you can even answer.
Yes, and what I would say is that, similar to my answer about the manifesto, like I want to be careful about this binary. It's like saying, well, we should either do everything or we should ignore it entirely. I'm like, well, I don't know. Like in the middle, we could say, actually, they had this kind of challenge, and I mean, I kind of described it to somebody the other day. In my 2 roles before I joined Spotify, I worked on kind of one big change over the course of that time. Like you shipped a product or some other thing, but it was like one big loop, right? At Spotify, we were doing those loops every 6 to 12 weeks. So over the course of 4.5 years, I tried 100 different changes. And that gives you some perspective, because you get to try something, not necessarily as long term, but there's a lot of interesting things that you can learn from it. And I think the way that the culture emerged and a lot of the things that were done were really, really cool. But I don't know, like, yeah, see what you can learn from it. And I'm happy to share what I've learned along the way. But yeah, copying verbatim, this is always sort of an odd one to me.
All right, Scott, there's a question for you. Well, Scott raised their hand anyway. Are you there, Scott? Perhaps not. No, we can't hear you, unfortunately. Do you want to type your message, Scott? For whatever reason, we cannot hear you. Scott is typing, as are several other users apparently. Hold fast, we've got this. Too long, I'll wait to see if I can fix it. Okay.
Can I circle back on something that Jay just said? So the thing, the second last message, which was a lot of BS is generated thanks to abusing the model. I think so. I had a really interesting conversation with Henrik, probably 6 years ago now, and I was expressing
Henrik,
some sort of
for anyone not aware, this is Henrik Nierberg, right?
Yes, correct. Sorry.
Yes.
And basically, the conversation, like the discussion that we had, was like, essentially in a number of organizations, I think what they're doing is, I don't want to sound too judgmental, but like if you're doing something that's really bad already, doing something different, even if it's not perfect, I think is often still a step forward. And in many cases, the fact that an organization takes the initiative to make a change, even if that change is not necessarily in the best direction, the fact that they're trying to experiment and have the opportunity to learn from it, that can be a profoundly powerful thing. So I want to be careful of saying, like, attaching these things to whether it's safe or agile or Scrum or the Spotify model or anything else like that. It's people doing things with these things, and I'm hesitant to say, like, put all of the blame on the person, because even the best ideas can be completely twisted to do something really, really dangerous and weird. But also, a really bad idea could possibly be, or maybe a not so great idea could actually be sort of better than a much, much, much worse idea, if that makes sense. But just a little bit of nuance to capture there. I think we get far too established into these, or deep down into this model is better than that one, whatever. It's like, do something useful, build a product that your customers want. Most companies that are doing effective things at this, they don't call it a model, and they didn't copy exactly what somebody else was doing. They tend not to talk about Agile, Safe Scrum, Spotify, whatever. They're just doing whatever they do. And that's cool. Like, you can learn something from it and experiment along the way. Anyway, just a little piece of nuance.
I added a quote which I often use, is that imperfect action is better than perfect inaction. So whether it's the best framework in the world, whether it's fit for purpose at that time, it's still something you can use to learn. You then pivot, you iterate, you adjust, you find what works for you. And coming back to those perspectives, those biases that we are subject to, it is perfectly normal and human to want to copy the success of others. Think about every time you buy a product these days, what's one of the first things you do? You look at the reviews. What has someone else said about buying this before? Because we want to see that someone else has failed first or made that mistake first. So it's normal to do that. It's human to do that, and it's okay to do that. And it's the awareness about these biases that's important, and trying to avoid them limiting us.
I would agree.
Jay, there's a question from you, and then I think we've got to wrap things up.
Oh, cracky. I forgot to take my hand down, but you basically said what I was going to say. That when we learn as human beings, like, often the first thing we do is copy. And you see that with kids. You'll mimic things because you're trying to learn. And then you figure out, hey, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. And that's the importance of feedback loops and reflecting. And then you learn and you do things differently. So I think Spotify for a long time was like the shiny thing that felt like, hey, this is cool and interesting. And it's not rigid. Well, not rigid, but it's not like, what everyone's talking about for years. So I think there's also a lot of that, but you said it better than me.
You see people doing the same thing, whether it's Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or Spotify or whatever. It's like, well, this person achieved some kind of thing that I admire, and they select different parts of it. Therefore, I want to emulate everything that they do. And it's like, I don't know. I think we should be a little bit more critical of how we pick and select those sort of things. There's good things and bad things in everything, and things will be contextually useful or maybe not, depending on our context. And that's an unsatisfying answer, because we want to know, how did this person have the success that we want? Can I just copy what they did? And usually the answer is no, unfortunately. And
All right. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, your engagement. Thank you, Cliff, for your awesome presentation about beyond copy and paste Agile and a little bit about perspective. Let's have one more round of reactions. Please don't use the Hey Daddy one. That's just too much. Love the air horn. All right. Have a wonderful Christmas if we don't see you before hands. Bye-bye. Thanks again, Cliff.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Thanks, Chris.